Catherine Deneuve, the undisputed queen of French cinema, has long been more than just a movie star. She is the embodiment of elegance, mystery, and timeless grace. With her flawless beauty and regal presence, she captivated the world, becoming the untouchable muse of Yves Saint Laurent and the eternal image of Marianne, the very symbol of French womanhood. For decades, she reigned as Europe's most enchanting woman, her icy allure hiding stories of love, loss, and resilience that few ever truly knew. Behind Catherine Deneuve's dazzling glow lay wounds so deep they left shadows on even her brightest moments. The world adored the untouchable beauty, yet few ever glimpsed the woman behind the icy gaze, one drenched in silent tears, carrying storms as fierce as they were unseen. Her life was a delicate dance between brilliance and collapse, where glory and heartbreak walked hand in hand, and long-buried truths waited to surface. Long before she draped herself in Yves Saint Laurent's creations or became the immortal face of French cinema, Catherine was simply a young woman standing quietly in the wings, captivated by her sister's shining talent. She could never have imagined how quickly that light would be stolen from her world, leaving a void that fame could never fill. This is the untold journey of a woman who embodied grace on the outside, while inside, she carried the weight of loss, love, and survival. Born in Paris in 1943 to a family deeply rooted in the performing arts, Catherine Deneuve was the third of 4 daughters. Her father, Maurice Dolic, was involved in film and radio, while her mother, Renée Simoneau, was a renowned stage actress and voice artist who dubbed Hollywood stars into French. Their home was filled with the rhythm of rehearsals, the echo of lines, and the weight of expectation. However, it was not a home filled with warmth. Affection was scarce. Silence was common. Even as a child, Catherine felt unseen in a family designed for performance. Amid this artistic chaos, she discovered one true sanctuary, Frannuis. Her older sister was not just talented, she was radiant. Frannuis had the ability to enter a room and change the atmosphere. She possessed that kind of magnetism. Catherine followed her like a shadow, never feeling resentment, only admiration. It was a love that was pure and intense. "I didn't need to speak," Catherine once remarked. She carried all the light for both of us. Yet, growing up with such profound love also meant living in fear of losing her. A quiet dread always lingered in Catherine's eyes, even in her childhood. Her happiness never came without the anxiety of it disappearing. Thus, she observed Frannuis's ascent from student performances to the dazzling lights of French cinema with both pride and trepidation. "I remember thinking," she later reflected, "if she ever vanished, I wouldn't know how to breathe." At the age of 12, Catherine left Catholic school and accidentally stumbled into the world of film, landing a minor role in L'École in 1957. She wasn't driven by ambition, she was on a quest for identity, for a place where she could be acknowledged. Her early performances were clumsy and hesitant, but something within her began to awaken. Each set provided her with a fragment of voice. She wasn't pursuing fame, she was in search of significance. Slowly, the applause began. Catherine hovered in her shadow, voluntarily, while François soared ahead, radiant and adored. Rivalry never existed. It was devotion. Catherine was the moon, happy to reflect her brightness, and François was the star. Their relationship was nearly mystical and divine. Catherine frequently whispered compliments to François from directors. "I wanted her to be pleased. For me, that was sufficient." Catherine struggled with loneliness behind closed walls. Lines from scripts filled their shared home, but not in a cozy way. Her parents were aloof, focused on their jobs and their expectations. Love had conditions. Feelings were subdued. Catherine discovered how to bear in silence, to weep in silence. Eventually, acting would be her only honest language. Catherine was starting to get noticed at the age of 19. There was weight in her gaze. Her quiet was quite telling. The world still loved François, though. Catherine didn't mind either. In her tumultuous sea, she continued to have faith that her sister would always be there. It was not yet time for the pain. The nightmare was still a ways off. However, it waited just outside the frame. Catherine must have sensed it even back then. She was not yet the goddess France would revere in those early years. She was a young woman, shaky and wide-eyed, clinging to one spark. In a world that provided neither security nor stability, she found love in her sister. In the shadow of her sister, Catherine Deneuve was starting to blossom silently, subtly, and constantly before the summer of 1967 rocked her world. Catherine seemed like the colder flame, graceful but aloof, quiet yet alluring, while François d'Orléac wowed the French cinema industry with his electrifying energy and charisma. Catherine, who was born in Paris into a creative family, appeared on cinema for the first time at the age of 13 in 1957. A quiet figure in a black-and-white photograph, her eyes still looking for light, her voice hardly more than a whisper. She had no aspirations of becoming famous. Not at all. Her initial aspirations were more in line with archaeology or possibly design, but cinema drew her in like gravity. While François flourished, she took small parts in mostly unrecognized movies throughout the early 1960s. Nevertheless, Catherine waited, observed, and learned. Her visage, those sad, big eyes, finally took over the screen in 1964 with Cherbourg's Umbrellas. The movie caused a stir. The directors started to move around. She was more than simply her sister now. Catherine Deneuve was her name. Nevertheless, she never got over the sense that François was her son. They couldn't be separated. They exchanged secrets, clothing, and screenplays. The rhythm of their laughter was the same. "We are one soul in two bodies," François once remarked. In more subdued moments, Catherine also believed it. They were together in an unusual and dazzling way, without rivalry. They believed there was space for both in the world. France, June 26, 1967. What started out as a typical day turned into a dark rift in Catherine Deneuve's spirit. The 25-year-old François, Catherine's constant light and a great starlet, died in a horrific vehicle accident while en route to a movie set. Like a cathedral scream, the news tore through Catherine. The one person who had always made the world bearable disappeared forever in a single breath. Words cannot express the magnitude of such a loss. At the age of 23, Catherine was on the verge of becoming well-known and beginning to be recognized as an actor in her own right in addition to being Francois's sister. Then her compass vanished without warning. She later said it was more than grief. It was confusion. I was following her melody. Catherine remained silent for the next few days. She was employed. She took a video. She walked into the fog like a shadow. On balconies, friends recall her smoking a chain and gazing into space. After that, according to directors, her eyes transformed. They had a bottomless object in their hands that they had not learned in training. She stood next to her mother during the funeral as she broke down in tears. Catherine refrained from crying. Then no. Years later, she would shed her tears. Surprisingly in a scenario where she was supposed to be acting distressed. She recounted, "It poured out without warning, I had no idea that I still had that anguish within me." Her performances started to take on a new level of seriousness after that. Her weapon was silence. Her voice was crisp but sparse. Her eyes were endless, unreadable, and wounded. Hollywood paid attention, but something else did too. The shadows. Constantly composed, Catherine started to distance herself from the spotlight, frivolity, and warmth. She constructed barriers. She declined parts involving excessive amounts of laughter. For decades, she never washed Francis's dressing gown. Her quiet was defined by the trauma, which also influenced her art. When reporters attempted to inquire about François, he gave them a cold look. "Some memories aren't meant to be shared," she once said to a friend in a whisper. But from that point on, that memory permeated every role she portrayed. The perpetual outsider in Indocin, the freezing courtesan in Bel Hour, and the suffering housewife in Ludier Metro. Catherine Deneuve's account does not mention François' passing. It was the fault line that gave rise to her tale. She was not broken by grief. She adopted it as her language. She became timeless as a result. However, none of that was evident during the first brutal days of the summer of 1967. Silence, a picture, and the inexplicable question that plagued her for decades were all that were left. Why not me? Catherine Deneuve could not back down from the catastrophe that broke her heart in 1967. She got up. And she changed as she rose. She was not silenced by her sadness. It added a sharp edge to her art. Only a few months after her sister passed away, Catherine took on one of her boldest and most significant roles. The mysteriously cold terrible in Louise Bunwell's 1967 novel Belle d'Or. A loyal bourgeois wife by day. In the afternoon, a sophisticated sex worker. It was scandalous, divisive, and upsetting. It was a masterpiece, though. Catherine reinvented what it meant to depict a woman's divided inner life through this unnerving duality. The audience was enthralled, but the critics were divided. For the first time, a heroine in a movie was so eerily beautiful and subtly tortured that she could simultaneously arouse and repel. However, this was just the start. She experimented with a variety of genres, including political drama, fairy tales, and gothic horror, with Tristana, 1970, Donkey Skin, 1970, and The Hunger, 1983. Every time, vanishing into a woman tormented by silence, disobedience, or longing. Her armor was her face, which was as cool as porcelain. 100 unsaid traumas were whispered by her impenetrable yet appealing eyes. In addition to her grace, directors were drawn to her because of her unparalleled ability to convey ideas without using words. She had previously depicted a spiral into lunacy in Roman Polanski's Repulsion, 1965, that was so horrifyingly realistic that viewers shrank back. She also received her first Caesar Award for her role as a theater actress who concealed her Jewish husband from the Nazis in François Truffaut's The Last Metro in 1980. Her performance was filled with dignity, grief, and silent horror. By 1992, when she starred in Indochine and was nominated for an Academy Award, the question of whether she was great had been resolved. It was the extent to which she could push the limits of on-screen feminine complexity. But there was a price for her ascent. She was misinterpreted by the public, who idolized her. They referred to her as unreachable, distant, and frigid. However, Catherine gradually saw that I wasn't aloof. I had something to protect. She shielded her weakness by putting it into her roles. In actuality, she layered her characters with the suffering she dared not express out loud, bringing every broken fragment of her personal sorrow into her artwork. Her partnerships with avant-garde filmmakers Bunwell, Polanski, Truffaut, and Demy were more than just significant turning points in her career. They were exorcisms of the mind. And her face, which was frequently likened to winter queens or marble statues, was never motionless. It was just keeping a storm under control that the world couldn't even comprehend. Catherine Deneuve was at her most powerful during this time. Not merely a star, but a symbol of strength, grief, and quiet defiance. Few people understood the cost she incurred in order to provide us with such truth, even while the world cheered her on the red carpet and silver screens. The hush that followed the tremendous applause was deafening. In addition to becoming the most well-known actress in French cinema, Catherine Deneuve was also among its most prosperous by the late 1980s. She commanded fees that mirrored her iconic fame and box office appeal, making her one of the most paid actresses in Europe. Her graceful, icy, and untouchably elegant persona came to represent luxury in general. As Yves Saint Laurent's lifelong inspiration, she was more than just a fashionista, she was fashion. She went on to sign advertising deals with Chanel and Louis Vuitton, which cemented her status as a brand and artist. Catherine, however, had no desire to pursue fortune. She famously remarked, "Style is not about money. It's about having something to say and saying it without speaking." Despite this, the paradox of her success grew as she stood at the pinnacle of her career, with 2 Caesar Awards, an Oscar nomination, and parts in almost 70 big motion pictures. She felt increasingly alone as she grew wealthier and more admired. The shy girl who had once stood in her sister's shadow was still there beneath the jewels and camera lights, more radiant than ever and more isolated than anyone realized. The world was enthralled by Catherine Deneuve's beauty. However, she was never able to be kept by anyone, including men, love, or promises. And that might be the most unsettling reality of all. There was a woman who bled silently, loved passionately, and lost repeatedly behind the classic face that was admired on red carpets. Her life was a lonely dance that never ended. And instead of leaving a bond, each man who stepped inside left a bruise. Her love tales were tragically and gloriously shattered, not just broken. Director Roger Vadim was her first big love. At the age of 17, she met him. Still a girl with dreams that make her shudder. The guy who once made Britt Bardot a star was almost 20 years older and dangerously charismatic. Despite the wishes of her family, Catherine moved in with him. She found agony and desire with him. She gave birth to their son, Christian, at the age of 20. However, the fairy tale didn't last long. She was repeatedly betrayed by Vadim, and the treachery became ingrained in her. That was the darkest point in my life, as Catherine subsequently characterized it. Hours would pass while she sat silently, gazing into space and hardly talking. Film was unable to save her. Something sacred within her had been shattered by love. It never fully healed since the agony was so severe and left such scars. It simply learned how to pose for pictures and wear pearls. Perhaps finding refuge where there had only been fire, she married British photographer David Bailey in 1965. It was a spectacular wedding. Although Mick Jagger was best man, the truth was a lie. Almost immediately, they parted ways. The marriage was not a unity, and when asked what she gained from it, she retorted icily, "I learned English." That was enough. A marriage stripped of meaning, a partnership in name only. It was a performance for the world. But backstage, she was already drifting into solitude. Before every heartbreak, there was a pause, a breath. Then came Morello Mastroianni, a famous Italian dish. Like a fever, their affair raged. Desperate to start over with Catherine, he left his wife. In 1972, they welcomed a daughter, Chiara. She refused to marry him despite the fact that he gave her everything, his name, his heart. Marriage is not something I believe in. I wish to maintain my independence even when I have a profound affection for someone. Her voice was steely and sorrowful as she spoke. Marcello was inconsolable. Catherine did not attend his burial when he passed away in 1996, despite his later statement that she was the love of my life, and she slipped through my fingers. That love was real. It was wild, imperfect, and unforgettable. She stayed at home by herself, crying quietly. More was stated by that absence than by any eulogy. It wasn't a lack of interest. The destruction was too profound to display. Her loves weren't always spectacular. Some were empty, quick, and odd. She jokingly said that Alain Delon, France's ideal heartthrob, was a disaster. He gave a politician's kiss. Rumors circulated concerning her and John Travolta, Burt Reynolds, and Clint Eastwood. Nothing persisted. It didn't matter. She reportedly fell in love with a young film set worker around 2000. She kept his name a secret. She subtly revealed that it was over 6 years later. No fuss, no proclamation, just another forgotten man in a long line. Each love ended in silence rather than rage. A sort of melancholy that doesn't scream but rather whispers. Her children Christian and Chiara became her safe haven, and she threw herself into them, maybe in an attempt to recapture a form of love that wouldn't break her. She once remarked, "I never wanted to belong to anyone. I only wanted to be left in peace." But peace came at a price. Even motherhood, however, was unable to take away the pain. Chiara once said of her mother, Catherine, that she was both the most present and the most absent person she had ever known. She would cook, clean, and bid her kids good night before disappearing behind closed doors, consumed by silence. She gave her all, but she kept something back, the piece of her that had never fully healed from being broken. By her 60s, the world had learned that Catherine Deneuve belonged to no one and that no man had ever truly understood her, perhaps on purpose. Her loneliness was not a wound she attempted to mend, rather, it became her truth, her weapon, and her haven. In sporadic interviews, tidbits of heartbreak were revealed. These words weren't just reflections, they were confessions from a heart still beating beneath layers of velvet armor. In her films, she played courtesans, queens, lonely wives, and immortal vampires, each role a piece of her truth. Belle Dower wasn't fiction, it was prophecy. Yes, I've loved. I've suffered. But I don't regret it. At least I've lived. She once remarked, acting is not pretending. She was a split, coveted, yet unreachable lady. It's remembering who you were before the world hurt you. Her performances were echoes of the struggles she never talked about, and Catherine Deneuve remained a paradox in both life and love, unforgettable, unachievable, and completely alone, and maybe her loneliness wasn't a weakness. Her life wasn't a tragedy, rather, it was a requiem sung in silk and shadow, where every sigh was a memory and every stillness a scream. Perhaps it was her masterpiece, the painful gift of a woman too big to be owned, too wild to be tamed, a woman who refused to be trapped by men, by marriage, or by time. The world watched her age with that same unbreakable grace, wondering if she ever truly loved or healed. Maybe the answer is not in her words, but rather in her silence, the silence of a woman who wore every scar like a jewel and carried every heartbreak with grace. Her greatest love story was with freedom rather than a man. Since her body had always obeyed her, it was her own body that would deal the most unexpected, intimate blow. Catherine Deneuve never truly belonged to anyone, and in that defiance, in that ache, in that eternal distance, she became legend. Love had eluded her, and loneliness had become her silent companion. But in late 2019, while filming Don Vivant, Catherine Deneuve passed away. There was no dramatic foreshadowing, no warning, just the terrifying silence of a stroke. The doctor said it was a minor incident, but to her it felt like the world had fallen apart. Every look, every step, and every breath on screen moved with a sort of divine orchestration. For someone whose image had been wrapped in timeless beauty, the betrayal of her own body was a blow more intimate than any heartbreak, but this wasn't the beginning of decay. It was the brutal realization that even she, the seemingly eternal face of French cinema, could break. Time, that silent predator, had finally reached her. It was the start of reckoning. Catherine had begun smoking at the age of 16, and by the time she was at the top of her game, cigarettes were her constant companion, 3 packs a day, no less, and she lit them like armor, releasing tension, grief, and loneliness in addition to smoke. In interviews, she dismissed smoking as a part of her mystique, image, and defiance, but beneath that cool exterior was a woman desperate for stillness, and in 1985, she turned to hypnotherapy as a way to keep herself together through the whirlwind of fame, failed loves, and inner restlessness. She smoked through everything. The movie is set in Paris, and the hotel balconies are in Cannes. She beat it for a while, but life started to creep back in, and the habit came back as silently as it had left, encircling her like an old toxic friend. Her body endured it all until it could no longer bear it. The stroke came not as punishment but as revelation. It was a violent mercy, it left no paralysis but it shook her to her very core. She did not cry in the hospital's sterile light. The early mornings alone before a shoot. Heartbreak, loss, and the silence that no applause could fill. Rather, she gazed at the ceiling and realized that something had to end. She chose to give up smoking completely and pursue a much more challenging path, transformation. The woman who had concealed her vulnerability behind cigarettes and movies for decades now started to give in to silence, to breathing, to life that was not lived. She turned to gardening in her quiet estate with a devotion that astounded even her closest friends and family. She dug with reverence, spoke to the flowers as if they held answers, meditated, and read a lot. There were no press announcements or relapses, just silence, resolve, and a garden. She started writing in a secret notebook, not about her career but about her breath, her anxieties, and her unexpected joys. One post read, "The silence in me is louder than any camera shutter." She went for a morning stroll alone in the orchard. "My mother doesn't talk much about pain, but you can see in her eyes that it never left," her daughter Kiera once remarked. Catherine had not been defeated by the stroke. It had snatched away the last of her delusions, exposing a woman who was still full of life but at last accepting its frailty. She had chosen to be authentic in a culture that had always expected her to be powerful, perfect, and ageless. She became even more unbreakable as a result, becoming older, suffering, and slowing down. Once it had scared her. It was now her silent victory. The pain in her knees was a comforting reminder that she was still moving. She welcomed the slower mornings as breathing room. She stopped checking herself in the mirror to see whether anything had changed over time. Rather, she sought what it had provided. Clarity, grace, and an uncommon bravery. She wasn't just getting by. One silent breath at a time, she was blossoming. Catherine Deneuve now lives in the silence of dusk after a career of glittering lights and cinematic victories. Discreetly, quietly, and according to her own terms. She has evolved into something even more elusive, a legend at rest, instead of the figure the world chases along red carpets. Catherine has retired from the spotlight since the sale of her cherished Château de Primard in 2021, opting instead for the peace and quiet of a small flat in Paris. It is a place without spectacle, tucked away in the left bank. A house filled with books, geraniums in pots, old photos, and quiet. Like an old shawl, the silence she once feared now envelopes her. The atmosphere is one of acceptance, gentleness, and introspection rather than sadness. She no longer seeks attention, praise, or roles. She is 81 years old and has accepted that while beauty ebbs and flows, presence grows. Her days start out quietly with gentle jazz and herbal tea. At the same hour every day, she strolls by herself through the Jardin de Luxembourg. She gives the gardeners a nod, occasionally stops by the statues, and frequently gets lost in her thoughts. Insiders say that although she rarely gives interviews, her days consist of peaceful routines, longhand writing, caring for her small balcony garden, and rereading her favorite books by Virginia Woolf, Simone de Beauvoir, and Marguerite Duras. Her diet has emerged as simple and restorative. Warm vegetable stews, ripe figs, inexperienced tea, no sugar, no meat. Your frame turns into your temple, she as soon as instructed a near buddy. However, it is also your records. Catherine now not appears on film units. The last few roles she took had been selected with exquisite care. Art movies made quietly, regularly by using young, idealistic directors who revered her. She mentored many now not with lectures however with glances and small particular recommendation. Her presence on set was described as electric-powered even in stillness. But even those appearances have now ceased. She has stated nothing publicly, but those close to her understand. Catherine has gently closed that chapter. On a few evenings she places a single rose in a vase and sits for hours with it as though in verbal exchange. Financially she is cozy, having long ago sold her most luxurious possessions. Her Yves Saint Laurent haute couture collection, one of the maximum good-sized of any muse, became auctioned off, not with remorse, but with readability. "I do not want attire to consider who I used to be," she said. "I want space to apprehend who I have ended up." Her modern-day house carries no relics of fame. As a substitute, it holds items of emotional weight. Chipped ceramic bowls, a painting from her son, a tiny silver spoon that after belonged to her mom. Each item is a testament to a life lived no longer just glamorously however deeply. As for own family, Catherine stays close along with her daughter Chiara Mastroianni who visits frequently. They're frequently seen walking collectively through the quiet streets, hardly ever speak me, at ease in their shared solitude. Catherine is likewise a grandmother 5 times over. And although she is not one for loud affection, she gives her love in cautious, smooth approaches. A headscarf knitted with the aid of hand, a book inscribed with observe, a jar of homemade fig jam. She has now not announced any public legacy plan. No museum, no foundation in her call. However, she has made discreet donations to arts establishments, funded scholarships for young actresses in want, and lent her call quietly without right to reasons she believes in. Her legacy, she insists, is not in monuments, but in memory. She stays a religious Catholic, nevertheless lighting candles at Saint-Sulpice. Whilst requested once if she feared death, she spoke back, I fear pain, but no longer endings. Some stories need silence. In that silence, Catherine Deneuve has discovered her grace. She isn't merely growing old. She is developing inward. Her existence now is a meditation on time, on selfhood, at the peculiar sharp splendor of fading. And in this she becomes even extra poignant than she ever become on screen. Because this Catherine, the woman unguarded, uncosted, is perhaps the maximum sincere portrait of all of them. She has nothing left to show. She has already reshaped cinema, stimulated generations of ladies to include their complexity, and stood as a beacon of beauty in a world that frequently confuses publicity for authenticity. However, it's miles in her quiet withdrawal that her authentic energy is discovered. She does not cling to the world. She permits it to don't forget her. And we do. We do not forget her no longer just in films or photographs, however within the manner she made us sense, visible, haunted, captivated. Her legacy is not static. It evolves with us. Each lady who refuses to apologize for her solitude. Each artist who needs to be more than stunning. Every soul who learns to love themselves in silence. They all bring a chunk of Catherine. In order we close this bankruptcy, we ask you, what has Catherine Deneuve intended to you? Which of her movies left a mark? Which moment in her adventure echoes something from your very own? Let us recognize within the remarks. Your recollections count number. If you determined beauty, sorrow, or electricity in her story, please like, share, and subscribe. Assist us hold alive the legacy of these who have lived, no longer simply publicly, but profoundly. This is not the quid of her story. But perhaps it's miles the component that subjects maximum. Now not whilst she become cherished by using millions, but whilst she subsequently discovered to adore the quiet. Thank you for watching.